Good afternoon, everyone. The topic of my presentation is trials in psychiatry, and my moderator is Dr. Ruparna. So, in this, we'll be studying about the introduction, the history of the various trials that occurred, types of clinical drug trials, the biases which we commonly see in the trials, famous drug trials in psychiatry, some of the clinical trials in India, and finally the conclusion. A cornerstone of the improvements in treatment in medicine in general and psychiatry in particular has been the introduction of an acceptable scientific approach to treatment evaluation, that is, the clinical trial. Such trials are also the cornerstone to the modern evidence based medicine movement. Initially, clinical trials in psychiatry largely involved the evaluation of drug treatments. However, now psychological therapies have also been subjected to the rigors of the clinical trial. Basically, the clinical trial is a medical experiment designed to evaluate which of the two or more treatments is more effective. It is based on one of the oldest principles of scientific investigation that new information is obtained from a comparison of alternate states. The three main components of a clinical trial are comparison of a group of patients given the treatment under investigation with another group of patients given either an old or standard treatment or an inert treatment generally known as a placebo, a method of assigning patients to the treatment and the control groups, and a means of assessing effectiveness, that is, a measure of outcome. A basic history about the clinical trials that occurred. A placebo-controlled randomly allocated trial of chlorpromazine for treating schizophrenia carried out in 1954 in Birmingham, UK by the husband and wife team of Joel and Chairman Elkis. In 1954, a trial performed by Linford Rees, who randomly allocated 100 anxious patients to either placebo or chlorpromazine. A trial undertaken at the Maudsley Hospital in London by David Davies and Michael Shefford to study the use of reserpine for treating depression. This trial began in 1953, but reports of it did not appear until 1955. Then, during the same period time, Mogens Schou and Eric Stromgren used a randomized trial and showed the effectiveness of lithium as a treatment for mania. So how do these clinical drug trials, they help us, or what they result in? New drugs can be developed by isolating the active ingredients in natural compounds, modifying the chemistry of other drugs, and from theoretical extension of basic science knowledge. Only about 1 in every 10,000 potential products reach the market, often taking 10 years or more, and after huge costs. Given the limited patent life, drug companies often adopt aggressive marketing strategies to recoup their costs and deliver profits for the shareholders. A new drug is first tested in animals to establish potential for desired effects and absence of unexpected or undesirable effects before going into the 4 phases in humans. So the four phases are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4 trials. In phase 1, we determine basic pharmacological parameters in human volunteers. Example, pharmacokinetics, adverse effects, tolerance. These are usually open or uncontrolled. Adverse effects are often measured both subjectively and objectively. Example, heart rate, blood pressure, EEG, etc. It requires 24-hour clinical observations and often exclude the young, women, and old. Because these studies are uncontrolled, some of the effects will be placebo effects. In phase 2 trials, we establish whether or not a given drug works in a variety of conditions. They are usually controlled in that some patients get placebo. In dose-ranging studies to determine optimal dosage, each group of patients getting a particular dose of the drug can be thought of as a control group for others. In phase 3 trials, these are also sometimes called comparative trials. They seek to determine the effects of a new drug with reference to those commonly used in clinical practice, usually randomized with a proportion of patients under placebo-controlled arm, tend to be larger than the phase 2 studies, and major aim is to satisfy regulatory authorities and achieve a product license. Then the phase 4 trials refer to various methods of surveillance to establish the frequency of any serious or unexpected adverse effects of a drug once it has been licensed and introduced into regular clinical practice. It is similar to audit and naturalistic outcome studies. So the types of clinical drug trials, uncontrolled trials, establish whether a treatment works at all and also the profile of adverse effects. However, non-specific or placebo effects cannot be excluded in the absence of a control group. Controlled trials, they allow evaluation against placebo or a pre-existing treatment, may reduce or control for placebo effects, in the absence of randomization, are still subject to selection bias, conscious or unconscious. Patients getting a new treatment tend to be less severely ill or have better prognosis. Beneficial effects of new drugs are typically overestimated by 30 to 40%. Then there are randomized control trials. Randomization increases the scientific quality or internal validity of a trial. There are problems with external validity, that is, patient able to give informed consent and willing to be randomized tend to differ from many potential participants. This limits their representativeness and hence the generalizability of the results to all the patients. RCTs designed to show a greater effect than placebo are required to establish efficacy. RCTs against comparator drugs are frequently too poorly powered to be able to show a difference, and claims of equal efficacy need to be treated with caution. Then there are pragmatic trials. They have more external but less internal validity. Pragmatic trials, they basically focuses on correlation between treatments and outcomes in the real world practice rather than focus providing positive explanations for outcomes, and they require extensive deconfounding with strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. Then the patients group are representatives, the interventions are routinely feasible, and outcome measures are clinically relevant. One option is to enroll patients for whom the clinician is uncertain as to which treatment should be prescribed. Pragmatic trials are increasingly being applied in psychiatry. Then there are patient preference trials. These are the specific type of pragmatic trials. Patients not willing to be randomized are given their preferred treatment. They are followed up as in the trial, and their results are compared with those who are randomized. Then there are crossover trials where all the participants receive 2 or more interventions, one after the other, with the 2 groups receiving a different treatment first. These are useful in relatively rare diseases where a small number do not permit an randomized control trial. However, it is difficult to ensure that the trial is long enough to see therapeutic effects, but short enough to avoid natural fluctuations confounding the trial. Also, there is the problem of carryover effects from first treatment period to the second and the potential for drug interactions. Washout periods of no treatment introduce new difficulties with sudden cessation of potentially effective treatments. Then there is N of 1 trials. These are crossover trials in which a patient is given 2 treatments, may be useful if it is not known which treatment they may benefit from, require patient consent and cooperation from the hospital pharmacy. Then there are audit and naturalistic outcome studies. These are not usually thought of as clinical trials, but are similar to phase 4 trials. These are uncontrolled and therefore unreliable, even if patients are used as their own historical control. Nevertheless, may provide valuable effectiveness information. Then there can be various biases in clinical trials. Bias is any systematic error in the determination of the association between exposure and outcome. Various biases are bias due to the confounding. It is due to the confounding factor, which is the one which is associated both with the disease and the outcome and is distributed unequally in the study and the control group. Then there can be memory or recall bias, selection bias, Bergsonian bias, expectation bias, publication bias and sponsorship publication bias, observer bias, information bias, and interviewers bias. Then some of the special problems of trials in psychiatry are the patients are too complex, interventions are too complex, the results are not generalizable, follow-up durations are too short, focus towards the clinical severity, and the last one is the compliance. Then the statistical issues which we generally see in clinical trials are the size of a clinical trial, drug doses in the clinical trials, the interim analysis, that is, many trials finish too early, usually because the investigators run out of the patients or money or both. But there are occasions when trials should finish before the intended completion date. Then there are missing values and dropouts in longitudinal data. So now I'll be studying about some famous drug trials in psychiatry. First of all, in the disease schizophrenia. First one is cost utility of the latest antipsychotic drugs in schizophrenia study, that is CUTLAS. CUTLAS was a pragmatic, open, multi-center, randomized control trial of first-generation antipsychotics versus the second-generation antipsychotics for schizophrenia, with blind rating of outcomes across 1 year. The trial was funded by the Health Technology Assessment Program of the United Kingdom National Health Service and received no financial support from the pharmaceutical industry. The objective was to test the hypothesis that in people with schizophrenia requiring a change in treatment, second-generation antipsychotics other than clozapine were associated with improved quality of the life across 1 year compared to the first-generation antipsychotics. It was a non-commercially funded, pragmatic, multi-site, randomized controlled trial of antipsychotic drug classes with blind assessments of 12, 26, and 56 weeks using intention to treat analysis. It was set up in 14 community psychiatric services in the English National Health Service. 227 people aged between 18 to 65 years with DSM-4 schizophrenia and related disorders assessed for medication review because of inadequate response or adverse effects. Randomized prescriptions of either first-generation antipsychotics or second-generation other than clozapine with the choice of individual drug was made by the managing psychiatrist. The main outcome measures were quality of life scale scores, symptoms, adverse effects, participant satisfaction, and the cost of care. The result was the primary hypothesis of significant improvement in quality of life scale scores during the year after commencement of second-generation antipsychotics versus first generation was excluded. Participants in the first generation antipsychotics arm showed a trend toward greater improvement in quality of life scale and symptom score. Participants reported no clear preference for either drug group. Costs were similar. There were no significant difference in outcome measures of adverse effects, participation satisfaction, and cost of care between first generation and second generation antipsychotic. So the conclusion was, in people with schizophrenia whose medication is changed for clinical reasons, there is no disadvantage across 1 year in terms of quality of life, symptoms, or associated costs of care in using first generation antipsychotics rather than non-clozapine second generation antipsychotics. Neither inadequate power nor patterns of drug discontinuation accounted for the result. Second was European first episode schizophrenia trial. The aim of European first episode schizophrenia trial was to compare treatment with amisulpride, quetiapine, olanzapine, and ziprasidone with a low dose of haloperidol in an unselected sample of first episode schizophrenia patients with minimal prior exposure to antipsychotics. This study was funded by 3 companies, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Sanofi Synthelabo, through European Foundation for Research in Schizophrenia, which was the governing body of the study. Baseline data were obtained between 4 weeks before and 1 week after randomization on demographics, diagnosis, current treatment setting, psychopathology, positive and negative syndrome scale, severity of the illness, which was measured through clinical global impression scale, overall psychosocial functioning through global assessment of functioning scale, extrapyramidal symptoms, so through SEND-HANS rating scale, adherence, and antipsychotics at 4 weeks after baseline, and neurocognitive performance. The primary outcome measure was retention in treatment, defined as time to discontinuation of study drug. Loss of retention can be the result of insufficient clinical effect or lack of tolerability or acceptance. Secondary measure included changes in different dimensions of psychopathology, side effects, compliance, social needs, quality of life, substance abuse, and cognitive functions. The result was, within 12 months, the proportion of patients with more than equal to 50% response were 37% for haloperidol, 67% for amisulpride, 67% for olanzapine, 46% for quetiapine, and 56% for ziprasidone. The UFIS study concluded that substantial proportions of first episode patients with schizophrenia showed clinically meaningful response and remission rates within 12 months. The proportion of response and remission were higher for the most second-generation antipsychotics as compared to haloperidol. The third one was a treatment of early onset schizophrenia spectrum disorder study, which was held in 2008. The study compared the efficacy and safety of 2 second-generation antipsychotics, olanzapine and risperidone, with a first-generation antipsychotic, molindone, in the treatment of early onset schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. Eligible subjects were randomly assigned to molindone, olanzapine, and risperidone treatment under double-blind conditions for 8 weeks. The study was designed to have a total of 168 subjects equally distributed among the 3 groups. Eligible participants were 8 to 19 years old, with a focus on primarily younger participants, so that 30% or fewer of the subjects were between 16 to 19 years old. Participants had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or schizophreniform disorder and had current positive psychotic symptoms of at least moderate intensity as rated on positive and negative syndrome scale. Study medications were packaged in identical color-coded capsule. Dosing was flexible, allowing for clinician judgment within the following dose range. Molindon 10 to 140 mg per day, olanzapine 2.5 to 20 milligram per day, and risperidone 0.5 to 6 milligram per day. In total, 119 youth were randomly assigned to the treatment. Of these subjects, 116 received at least one dose of treatment and thus were available for analysis. No significant differences were found among treatment groups in response rates. Molindon 50%, olanzapine 34%, risperidone 46%, or magnitude of symptom reduction. Olanzapine and risperidone were associated with significantly greater weight gain. Olanzapine showed the greatest risk of weight gain and significant increase in fasting cholesterol, low-density lipoprotein, insulin, and liver transaminase levels. Molindon led to more self-reports of akathisia. The conclusion was risperidone and olanzapine did not demonstrate superior efficacy over molindon for treating early onset schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. The safety findings related to weight gain and metabolic problems raise important public health concerns given the widespread use of second-generation antipsychotics in youth for non-psychotic disorders. The second are the mood disorders. First study is bipolar depression, Boulder 1 study. The efficacy and safety of quetiapine was compared with placebo in the treatment of depressive episodes in patients with bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 disorder. 542 outpatients with bipolar 1 or 2 disorder experiencing a major depressive episode according to DSM-4 were randomly assigned to 8 weeks of quetiapine, 600 or 300 milligram per day or placebo group. The primary efficacy measure was mean change from baseline to week 8 in the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale total score. The result was quetiapine at either dose demonstrated statistically significant improvement in Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale total scores compared with placebo from week 1 onward. The proportion of patients meeting response criteria at the final assessment in the groups taking 600 and 300 milligram per day of quetiapine were 58.2% and 57.6% respectively versus 36.1% for placebo. This was the first randomized parallel group placebo-controlled trial to evaluate the efficacy of quetiapine in bipolar depression. Quetiapine monotherapy has significant antidepressant efficacy in a group of patients with bipolar 1 or 2 depression based on the primary efficacy scale. The limitation of this study was, first, the number of enrolled patients with bipolar 2 disorder was not sufficient to draw firm conclusion regarding efficacy in the subgroup, and secondly, moderate rates of sedation or somnolence were observed in both quetiapine groups, which might have compromised the integrity of the double-blind design. Second was bipolar depression Boulder 2 study. This was a pilot study comparing the effects of quetiapine and placebo for the treatment of depressive episodes in adolescents with bipolar 1 disorder. 32 adolescents aged between 12 to 18 years with a depressive episode associated with bipolar 1 disorder were randomized to 8 weeks of double-blind treatment with quetiapine 300 to 600 milligram per day or placebo. The primary efficacy measure was change in children's depression rating scale, revised version, scores from the baseline to endpoint. The result was there was no statistically significant treatment group difference in change in the CDR-SR scores from baseline to endpoint or in the average rate of change over the 8 weeks of the study. Additionally, there were no statistically significant differences in response, placebo 67% versus quetiapine 71%, or remission, placebo 40% and quetiapine 35%, or change in HAM-A, YMRS, or CGI-BPS scores between treatment groups. Dizziness was more commonly reported in quetiapine than in the placebo group, and the conclusion was the results suggest that quetiapine monotherapy is no more effective than placebo for the treatment of depression in adolescents with bipolar depression. Then third one was efficacy of monotherapy Seroquel in bipolar depression, Embolden 1 study. It is one of the 2 large similarly designed studies that compared the efficacy of tolerability of quetiapine monotherapy with that of placebo for the acute treatment 8 weeks of bipolar 1 and 2 depression, followed by 26 to 52-week continuation treatment phase. The study included lithium as a comparator arm. The aim of this study was to compare the efficacy and tolerability of quetiapine and lithium monotherapy with that of the placebo for a major depressive episode in bipolar disorder. 802 patients with DSM-4 defined bipolar disorder were randomly allocated to quetiapine 300 mg per day or quetiapine 600 mg per day, lithium 600 to 1800 mg per day, or a placebo group for 8 weeks. Primary endpoint was the change in Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale total score. The study was conducted from August 2005 to May 2007. The conclusion was quetiapine 300 to 600 mg per day was more effective than placebo for the treatment of episodes of acute depression and bipolar disorder. Lithium did not significantly differ from placebo on the main measure of efficacy. Both treatments were generally well tolerated. The fourth one was efficacy of monotherapy Seroquel in bipolar depression 2 study. The study was a further continuation of the Embolden 1 study. Aim of the study being to evaluate the efficacy and tolerability of quetiapine and paroxetine monotherapy for major depression and bipolar disorder. 740 patients with major depressive episodes according to DSM-4 were randomly assigned to quetiapine 300 mg per day, quetiapine 600 mg per day, paroxetine 20 mg per day, or a placebo group for 8 weeks. The primary endpoint was the change from baseline in Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale total score. The conclusion was quetiapine 300 to 600 mg per day, but not paroxetine, was more effective than placebo for treating acute depressive episodes in bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder, there was a study, pediatric OCD treatment study, which was known as POTS in 2023. The purpose of this study was to evaluate the efficacy of CBT alone and medical management with the SSRI sertraline alone or CBT and sertraline combined as initial treatment for children and adolescents with OCD. The pediatric OCD treatment study was a masked randomized control trial conducted in 3 academic centers in the United States and enrolled a volunteer outpatient sample of 112 patients aged 7 to 17 years with a primary DSM-4 TR diagnosis of OCD and a children's Yale-Brown obsessive compulsive scale score of 16 or higher. The interventions were participants were randomly assigned to receive CBT alone, sertraline alone, combined CBT and sertraline, or placebo for 12 weeks. Main outcome measures were change in CY box score over 12 weeks as rated by an independent evaluator masked to treatment status, rate of clinical remission defined as a CY box score less than or equal to 10. The results were 97 out of the 112 patients completed the full 12-week treatment. Intent to treat random regression analysis indicated a statistically significant advantage for CBT alone, sertraline alone, and combined treatment compared to the placebo. The rate of clinical remission for combined treatment was 53.6%, for CBT alone was 39.3%, for sertraline was 21.4%, and for placebo was 3.6%. The study concluded that children and adolescents with OCD should begin treatment with a combination of CBT plus an SSRI or CBT alone. Now in the autism, there was a sponsored studies to advance autism research and treatment. This study determined the efficacy and safety of citalopram hydrobromide therapy for repetitive behaviors in children with autism spectrum disorder. Setting was in the 6 academic centers. 149 volunteers 5 to 17 years of age were randomized to receive citalopram or placebo. Participants had autistic spectrum disorders, Asperger's disease, or pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. They had illness severity rating of at least moderate on the CGI-S and scored at least moderate on compulsive behaviors measured with the CY box modified for pervasive developmental disorders. 12 weeks of citalopram hydrochloride, 10 milligram per 5 ml of placebo was given. The result was there was no significant difference in the rate of positive response on the clinical global impressions improvement subscale between citalopram treated group and the placebo group. There was no difference in the score reduction on the CY box modified for pervasive developmental disorders from baseline for the citalopram treated group or the placebo group. Results of this trial do not support the use of citalopram for the treatment of repetitive behaviors in children and adolescents with ASDs. Now, for the anxiety disorders, there was a child-adolescent anxiety multimodal CAM study. This study was designed to address the current gaps in the treatment literature by evaluating the relative efficacy of cognitive behavioral therapy, sertraline, a combination of two therapies, and a placebo group. In this randomized control trial, 488 children between ages of 7 to 17 years who had a primary diagnosis of separation anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, or social phobia were assigned to receive 14 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy, sertraline, at a dose of up to 200 milligram per day, a combination of sertraline and cognitive behavioral therapy, or a placebo group for 12 weeks in a ratio 2:2:2:1. The percentages of children who were rated as very much or much improved on the clinical global impression improvement scale were 80 to 80.7% for combination therapy, 59.7% for CBT, and 54.9% for sertraline. All the therapies were superior to placebo. Combination therapy was superior to both the monotherapies. So both CBT and sertraline reduced the severity of anxiety in children with anxiety disorders. A combination of the two therapies had a superior response rate. Now, some of the clinical trials in India. First one is risperidone in the treatment of acute mania, a double-blind placebo-controlled study. One of the three pivotal trials that was the basis for FDA approval for risperidone in acute mania was a trial conducted exclusively in India. This was a placebo-controlled trial on 290 patients hospitalized during an episode of acute mania. Patients with bipolar disorder were admitted to hospital and subjected to a washout of all medications for up to 3 days before they were assigned to risperidone or placebo arm. No other psychiatric drugs could be given in addition as long as they were enrolled in the trial. Lorazepam could be given for control of symptoms, but only for up to first 10 days of the trial. Those in the risperidone arm started with a 3 milligram dose. Daily doses were then reduced or increased at the discretion of the investigator. The trial lasted for 3 weeks. When patient entered the trial, their symptoms were evaluated on a scale, the Young Mania Rating Scale. The trial found that risperidone was effective in acute mania and also well tolerated. Extrapyramidal symptoms were the most frequently reported adverse event. Second is placebo-controlled trial for quetiapine extended release for acutely ill patients in schizophrenia. Patients with a diagnosis of acute schizophrenia were considered for the trial. They had to have a minimum PANSS score indicating that the condition was severe. A total of 588 patients were taken off their regular antipsychotic medications at least 48 hours before being randomly assigned to quetiapine extended release, quetiapine immediate release, or placebo. The primary endpoint was a change in patient state over 6 weeks of the study. The study was also designed to identify a clinically relevant dose range for the extended release version of quetiapine. 446 patients were completed the study. Patients were recruited at 39 centers in Bulgaria, Romania, Russia, Greece, and India also. The study concluded that the extended release version of quetiapine was as effective as the immediate release version of the drug, and both were more effective than placebo in patients with acute schizophrenia, and that the drug was well tolerated. The third one was a clinical trial to study the effects of 2 different doses of folic acid as an augmenting agent with antidepressant drug fluoxetine in patients with depressive episode. This was a randomized double-blind parallel group single-center comparative trial of antidepressant augmentation by high 5 milligram per day and low 1.5 milligram per day doses of folic acid. Fluoxetine 20 milligram per day was the antidepressant. 30 patients were recruited. Primary outcomes were the scores on HDRS and BDI over 6 weeks. This trial was conducted and funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, Bangalore. So the conclusion is, although clinical trials play a major role in the development of new drugs and in the assessment of their effectiveness, they have been associated with many problems of an ethical nature, such as the issues of informed consent and the use of placebo. Randomized control trial is an important modality of the clinical trial with wide acceptability, but it too is plagued with issues relating to generalizability and validity of its results. In recent times, a more acceptable method, the pragmatic randomized control trial, is being used, the results of which are more generalizable and which measures functional outcomes rather than the symptomatic improvement. Care should be taken of the special population groups who have received scant attention till date. The aim of future clinical trials should be to develop more cost-effective drugs which have better side effect profile. This is particularly important for developing countries like India, which have plenty of patients and resources to conduct useful drug trials. This is my reference.
What is Parkinsonian bias?
Then Parkinsonian bias, it occurs due to the different rate of the admissions in the hospital and the facility, the bias that occurs due to that. So, due to the different rate of admissions in the hospitals.
So, years are got less hospitals. Do you know what is the Rodo work verdict in psychotherapy? Studies are like taken the reference from this. It is in the last 10 years. That is why you're missing very significant studies in psychiatry. Stardy, FBD. These are very significant studies in India also passed their IPS study, very significant in schizophrenia, etc. Okay. Anyway, the subject is very vast. We have included 2 studies from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. What do we study best in phase 1?
The phase 1 is mostly to see the adverse events and how they are affecting the population which we are testing.
Phase 1 is basically safe.
Safe, yes, sir.
Okay. Efficacy is not that much. And most of the time, healthy human beings. Even patients who are not having it. So if you are testing an antipsychotic, so we start off with patients who do not have symptoms. We start off with that and just see the pharmacokinetics and the adverse events. Right. And phase 2 is where you study the efficacy also and safety also. Okay, and phase 3 is on a larger scale. What is phase 4 study?
Phase 4, it's in which the drug has come in the market and it is being used by the patients, and then we are more then we are studying that.
Post-marketing.
Yes, post-marketing.
Okay. Post-marketing service. The drug is already there, but you don't stop there. You continue. You know 3 medicines that have been taken off the market after phase 4 studies. There have been drugs that have been off the market after phase 4 studies. Declared phase 1 and phase 4, they were taken off. Some pride is one. Okay. Then there are some drugs which are used for lowering cholesterol. They found that it increased PPK. These incidents are also.
One which we used to study is thalidomide that causes.
Thalidomide is often era when clinical trials did not. Actually, thalidomide is one of the events in the history of medicine where It then started off that we should have clinical trials. Before that, patients were not. Can you tell me a country where clinical trials are not? Clinical trials are not a law. They just study data from other places. Japan. Japan has a very peculiar, you can say, the availability of medicines there is so weird that they just approve drugs based on some of the legal medicines are not available there. Even their vaccine also, for the COVID vaccine, it was approved very late. Very, very strict in reducing medicine deaths. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know if they have changed now, but Japan, technical technology is so advanced. Very, very problem, very difficult, but you should know. जो क्लासिक स्टडीज आएंगी एफपीटी स्टारडी आईपीएस स्टडी there are a lot of studies, there are a lot of ethics studies. One of the studies that you will find from comprehensive professor to be where we studied that short length and long length, people, which proved that stressor itself is not sufficient to cause depression. Okay, so there are these landmark studies which have proven that shifted the whole, you can say, outlook of psychiatry. Here we know only psychology, then biology. Now we are moving forward. Okay. Okay. Titles want to try it and see. Presentation give more topics. You have to work on that. Make it more specific. Like it could be trials. That also will be very vast. Yeah, trials in last 5 years, last 10 years, that will again or famous studies. It is the bedside assessment of attention. Bedside. इमरजेंसी में तुम लोगों के पास में जो केस आता है, कॉल आता है, वो कहाँ से आता है? ये वो से आता है. कितने केसेस, मतलब कितने एवरेज में लोगों के पास आ जाते हैं रोज के?
Sometimes 7 to 8 cases also.
Okay, 4, 10.
It's a 10.
उसमें कितने केसेस तुमको लगता है कि पेशेंट्स साइकियाट्री के एवेल्यूएशन हो जाते हैं?
50%. 50%.
50% of them come themselves for psychiatric evaluation.
Mostly they are घबराहट, HIV, that complaint.
So number one, we have to assess whether it is an emergency or not. Okay, prior study. जब लगता है तुमको भी ऐसे ही पेशेंट को देर हो गई, वो परसों कितने मिनट से बात कर रहे थे, like the attendant came that my medicine is finished, so I'm ready to propose. On a Sunday, on a Sunday, and he's calling me and I don't know how he found my number. Sir, यहाँ पे तो आपकी कोई आई ना देखने के लिए. Sir, I said, sure, he is there. So don't entertain such patients. If you find that the patient is not available, simple घबराहट, बेचैनी, low panic attack, do nothing. Come to OPD for a detailed evaluation, right? Etc. Number one. Number two, in all the cases, please write that the patient has come for medical evaluation. The patient has come with problems of dizziness. Okay. Because there is this thing that psychiatry is one to 10 minutes today. So normally it's 10 minutes. Okay. So getting knowledge like okay. You just give a specialized history. So you go, you find out if it is a psychiatric patient. First of all, you have to that the patient has come here for medical evaluation, the patient has come here for sepsis. Okay. So वो rule out कर लेंगे, then that is a reference. That is not an emergency. ठीक है? So you treat it as a reference. Okay. तो वहाँ पर जो register में patient आता है, तो जैसे patient कैसे करते हैं, जैसे patient ने emergency में आया, तो पहले तो वहाँ पे वो देखेगा, वो ऐसा क्या जो देखेगा, वो कुछ डॉक्यूमेंट करता है, लेकिन उसी वक्त वो बुलाया जाता है.
They just mention one or two complaints, and sometimes that also, sir, they copy from our history only. Yes, sir.
हाँ. पास हिस्ट्री में तो नहीं है, अगर जो चीज कंप्लेंट है उसके लिए आएगा. पास हिस्ट्री कैसे, पास हिस्ट्री ऑफ प्रॉपर्टी वो भी है.